Thanks for your support as a channel member, DarkForce2543! Yuki Tsunoda is finally getting his shot at the Red Bull seat alongside Max Verstappen, but not after the bosses at Red Bull embarrassed themselves once again by promoting a young driver too soon. Tsunoda makes his Red Bull debut at this weekend's 2025 Japanese Grand Prix after the team dumped Liam Lawson just 2 rounds into the season. But how would the Japanese driver get on across a full campaign alongside Verstappen? That's what we're about to find out on F1 Manager 24. To do it, I created a new team and used the new driver lineup editor feature to make the 2025 roster the way it probably should have been to start with. Tsunoda becomes the Perez replacement as Lawson remains in his seat at Racing Bulls after the team booted out Daniel Ricciardo at the Singapore Grand Prix last year. For fans of Sergio and Danny Ric though, fear not, because they are still on the grid. They're going to be driving for our created team. However, we won't be developing our car at all, so they'll just be running around at the back. Our sole focus will be on Tsunoda's performances. How will the 82 rated driver get on against the reigning world champion? Let's find out. We start the season in Australia and Yuki qualified 6th for the opening round. Not too bad, but he was a whopping 9/10 of a second off Verstappen, who was on pole position. But Tsunoda's first race for the team came to an early end on lap 3 as he crashed out of the race. Verstappen would go on to finish second between the two McLarens. Yuki did get his first points of the year though in the China sprint, finishing in 7th, and he came home 8th in the Grand Prix, albeit over a minute behind the winner, as Piastri led a McLaren 1-2, just like in real life. Verstappen collected another podium as Red Bull clung on to second in the Constructors early in the season. Next up is Yuki's home race in Japan at the legendary Suzuka Figure of 8 circuit. Despite qualifying 8th, Red Bull started Tsunoda from the pit lane, presumably after some sort of engine or gearbox change after qualifying. By lap 17, Tsunoda has worked his way back into the top 10, although he fell out of it after his first pit stop. He eventually clawed his way up to 8th as Norris took the win from McLaren. Verstappen was again on the podium. A podium looked possible in Bahrain for Tsunoda after an undercut got him ahead of Verstappen, Russell and Leclerc. But Yuki was kept out for a long middle stint and he eventually came home in 6th place, which is still his best result of the season so far. The McLaren dominance continued as Piastri won for the second time this year. In Jeddah, Perez dramatically crashed out, showing he still has a skill issue, and a quiet race was livened up by Jack Doohan crashing and bringing out the safety car. Red Bull put Tsunoda on the hard tyres while the drivers around him were on softs. Despite falling to 10th at one stage, the hard tyres came in clutch for Yuki as he rose to 6th ahead of both Ferraris, while Piastri won again. With Antonelli scoring a podium though in Jeddah, Red Bull dropped to 3rd in the Constructors behind Mercedes. Tsunoda missed out on points in the Miami sprint and we saw the Grand Prix halted after Antonelli and Gasly collided. It meant that Yuki was suddenly thrust into contention for the victory after passing Verstappen, Russell and the Ferraris. And by the time we reached the final lap, Yuki was leading ahead of George Russell. But the Mercedes driver snatched the win from Tsunoda at the final corner, denying him a famous victory. Yuki had however done enough to finish second ahead of Hamilton as Verstappen came home 6th. After a quarter of the season, Tsunoda sits 7th in the drivers' standings with 44 points, while Piastri holds a 9-point advantage over his teammate Lando Norris at the top. Red Bull are still a point behind Mercedes despite Russell's Miami win. Tsunoda was going well in Imola and in with a shot of another podium, but he spun on lap 26 when chasing Antonelli, losing him critical time. Despite that though, he undercut the young Italian and found himself fighting Verstappen in the closing laps. The Dutchman was carrying an issue, but that didn't stop Yuki hustling him for P4 as Norris took the win. There may have been some team orders at Red Bull because Verstappen stayed ahead. A dull race in Monaco was spiced up by this collision between former Red Bull drivers Pierre Gasly and Alex Albon, which led to a safety car. It allowed Yuki to make a free stop for fresh softs, while the leaders stayed on old tyres. But in an anticlimactic finish, Tsunoda was unable to pass anyone ahead of him, coming home in 7th. Antonelli's 5th place took the young Italian back above Tsunoda in the standings. The Japanese driver went pointless in Spain, falling out of the top 10 after battling a mechanical issue for much of the race. Piastri beat Norris to further extend his championship lead. Tsunoda was running 8th in a wet Canada race when the race was red flagged after Hadjar shunted into Alonso. Red Bull put Yuki on the softs when the track dried out shortly after the restart and he rose to P6, running with the lead group. But his pace wasn't strong enough for him to stay there and he eventually fell behind Antonelli and Hamilton. battling Lawson for P8 on the last lap. The pair were side by side on the final straight, Tsunoda edging ahead with the DRS. It was a crucial move as it helped Red Bull move back above Mercedes in the constructors. In Austria, Yuki had an early lockup which dropped him from 7th to P last, and having recovered to 10th, another error dropped him to 12th. Yuki was back in the points though at Silverstone, finishing in 8th. It means that halfway through the year he has 68 points compared to Verstappen's 179. His patchy run of form has also allowed Mercedes to open up a 35-point gap to Red Bull in the constructors. Tsunoda picked up a point in the Belgium sprint as Verstappen took the victory, and the Grand Prix was stopped after this collision involving Doohan, Perez and Sainz. Tsunoda was running 6th after the red flag, but he tumbled down to 12th with this spin. He did recover to P10, but Verstappen proved the car's pace by taking Grand Prix victory. Tsunoda had his best qualifying of the season so far in Hungary, starting from 5th on the grid. He even managed to pass teammate Verstappen at turn 1. Despite losing a couple of positions across the race, he came home in 6th. After the summer break, Tsunoda found himself starting at the back with Perez and Ricciardo thanks to a grid drop in the Netherlands. And despite some classic Mexican Minister of Defence moves, Tsunoda soon found his way past. The Japanese driver worked his way up the field and found himself fighting Verstappen on the final lap once again. However, he had to settle for 6th as his tyres were well past their best. Tsunoda carried his Zandvoort form into Monza, qualifying 3rd, and he just held on to the position when an early safety car was called. He spent several laps in the lead fight at the restart, but this mistake at the Ascari chicane brought his race to an early end. I'm not sure why he retired, as there's no visible damage to the car, but anyway, Verstappen would go on to snatch victory from Piastri on the last lap. Yuki's race in Baku lasted all of 3 corners as he crashed out at turn 3 on lap 1. Verstappen won again, edging out Piastri with DRS in a drag race to the line. Tsunoda started from the pit lane in Singapore, eventually fighting his way up to 7th. And he was on his way to another steady 7th place finish in Texas when Perez stopped on track and caused a late red flag. He moved up a spot at the restart and then lost out to Antonelli, fighting for 5th as Verstappen took another win. However, P6 took Tsunoda to a century of points for the season. In Mexico, Yuki had a storming opening to the race, rising from 7th at the start to the lead by lap 7. While the promise of a victory faded, Tsunoda was still able to finish in 4th position as Verstappen broke down midway through the race. George Russell joined the dominant McLarens on the podium. Tsunoda was 5th in the Brazil sprint and he was in with a shot of a podium in the Grand Prix. But as the track dried from a rain shower, he lost crucial time at a pit stop, having to wait behind Verstappen. It meant he fell from 5th to 7th. Yuki narrowly avoided disaster at the start in Las Vegas as Norris collided with Russell at turn 1. He'd later run as high as 2nd, battling Norris and Verstappen as Piastri ran clear. Norris fell away from the podium battle and it came down to the Red Bull pair to squabble over P2 on the final lap. However, Yuki missed out on DRS as they ran down the strip for the final time, consigning him to 3rd place, still a decent result. Piastri's win crowned him as the world champion in a season he'd ended up dominating. The double podium also elevated Red Bull back above Mercedes in the constructors, mostly thanks to Verstappen's 4 race wins. Tsunoda picked up 7th in the Qatar sprint and after managing a technical issue in the Grand Prix came home in 8th. However, that was only because 9th down was a lap behind, because Tsunoda ran out of fuel before crossing the finish line. Yuki completed his first season at Red Bull with a 5th place finish in Abu Dhabi, although he wasn't far from catching Russell for 4th. Despite not passing the Mercedes, finishing between the 2 Brackley-based cars meant Red Bull pinched 2nd place in the Constructors' Championship. Tsunoda finished 8th in the drivers' table with 153 points, which is one more than Perez managed in reality in 2024, while Verstappen racked up a massive 400. The Dutchman scored 4 wins and 15 podiums, while Tsunoda only reached the top 3 on 2 occasions. In the comparison against Verstappen, Tsunoda doesn't particularly stack up well. His race pace on average was half a second slower than the lead Red Bull, while in qualifying he was almost a second slower. His average qualifying position was 7th, while his average race finish placing was 8.8. How would you rate Tsunoda's season at Red Bull in this save? I would give it a 6 out of 10. However, in reality, would he keep his seat for 2026, scoring just 2 podiums and scoring less than 40% of Verstappen's points? I say he would, but a difficult start to the 2026 season would see him bend off Liam Lawson style as well. Next week's video won't be an F1 Manager video, it will be the highlights of the final 2 rounds of Season 3 in the AHGP Community Racing League, but we will return to F1 Manager the following week with another F1 2025 simulation, but this time all the cars will start as equals. That's all for today then, thanks for watching, you're the best fans, and remember, be fast or be last.